Thank you for joining us today for this webcast titled Real Estate Strategy, Understanding Leverage Points in Negotiation and the Trickle-Down Impact on Your Bottom Line. Hi, my name is Kenny Ogilvie, and I am the Board Chairman of the ACG Pittsburgh chapter. I'm also Chairman and Executive Officer at EHS Support. First, before we begin, I'd like to thank our ACG Pittsburgh annual sponsors. We would not be here without their generosity, especially at this time of the year when things are so uncertain during COVID. We are very grateful. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please let me know or reach out to Micah Whitfield. Since our sponsors have been so good to us this year, we've decided to offer free attendance to all regular virtual programming, and your sponsorship will also include a free membership to the ACG Pittsburgh chapter for an individual in your organization under the age of 40 years old. All right, now let's move on to today's event. Our webcast features two dynamic speakers. I know both of them, and you're going to enjoy this session. First, Kevin Riley, founder and president of Totum Realty Advisors. And second, Jack Surman, a senior associate at Tecum Capital. If you have any questions for the panel during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom window to ask, and the panelists will answer as many questions as they can. So Kevin and Jack, go ahead and take it over.
Thanks, Kenny. And obviously thanks to all the participants out there. I know it's a little bit weird being on Zoom for these types of things and not having live interaction, but we're excited to be here and really thankful to ACG and to all the sponsors for asking us to be a part of today's event. As a little bit of background, as Kenny said, my name is Kevin Riley, the founder and president of Totum Realty Advisors. Totum is a 2-year-old business, but I've been in the real estate industry for 17 years. And throughout those 17 years, basically focus on 3 different things. One is helping occupiers of real estate make better real estate choices in order to drive their overall business success. Big believer that real estate can have a dramatic impact on the bottom line, and not just by reducing expense, but by creating environments that make your business more successful via attraction of talent, retention of talent, attraction of customers, distribution, better processes. So a holistic view at how real estate can impact total revenue and total profit. The second piece of our 3-legged stool is helping private equity and venture capital firms think holistically about their portfolio and how to drive enterprise value by making sound real estate decisions across all layers of the enterprise. And then third, the more traditional sense, helping investors in real estate maximize returns. And we're also an investor ourselves. So we sit in the seat where we understand what it takes to increase profitability on a real estate deal, and therefore feel really comfortable advising people on how to make the best decisions possible. So with that, turn it over to Jack. Excited to get started today.
Thanks, Kevin. And big shout out to Kelly and the ACG squad. And thank you to everybody for involving Tecum and myself personally. For those of you that are not aware, Tecum is a provider of private capital to the lower middle market. The founding partner, Steve Jurjevich, started inside of First National Bank, hired the 2 subsequent partners, Matt Harnett and Tyson Smith. I'm sure familiar names to a lot of you. Inside the bank, they did some off-balance sheet stuff, and then regulatory actions took over, and they spun out to form their first SBIC fund, small business investment company, raise private capital, borrow from Uncle Sam in the form of the Small Business Administration at 0 cost to the taxpayer. And had a $170 million vehicle with a 2013 vintage for our first fund, did 26 deals there. And then in 2017, launched a $265 million vehicle, which we're investing out of currently, 23 deals to date. And we're in the midst of raising for Fund 3. I'll probably get in trouble if I make this too much of a fundraising pitch. So we're well on our way, and hopefully we'll be live in springtime next year. So moving on to why we're here today. Much of Tecum's business revolves around buying and selling companies at the appropriate valuation. A lot of things play into that valuation: revenue, margins, multiples, etc. One thing that probably doesn't get as much focus as it should, that could play a material part in the valuation, is real estate. So we've got Kevin, real estate expert, here to help us understand mortgage payments, rent payments, utilities, everything that is another dollar out of an investor's pocket, how we can get the most out of our real estate to help the company's valuation. So Kevin, maybe to get started, how does the real estate industry think about valuation? I mean, we're used to talking multiples, some revenue, but what does a landlord or yourself think about when we say valuation?
Yeah, and I think it's a great place to start, because I think there's this disconnect between valuation on a business front and on a real estate front, but at the end of the day, they're extremely similar. You talk about multiples, and real estate people talk about cap rates. And all a cap rate really is the rate of return on the investment based on the net income that's being generated by the asset. So for every dollar of reoccurring revenue that gets created, they divide that by the rate of return. And a lower cap rate, this is sometimes confusing to people, you hear a cap rate of 5 or a cap rate of 8. A cap rate of 5 is a better value, or it's similar to saying a higher multiple. And, you know, the misconception is that the real estate investors or owners of property aren't in business to make money, but I assure you that they are. And their goal is to increase net operating income, which therefore increases the value of the real estate. And whether they're long-term holders of that real estate, whether they're selling it or whether they're trying to refinance it, every dollar earned is, as I said, in your terms, a multiple of what the real estate's worth. And once you understand that very simple concept, I think it opens up the door to lots of possibilities of how to create leverage as a tenant or a buyer or a seller of real estate.
So in my elementary understanding of real estate valuation, I mean, I know the concept of recurring revenue comes up, right? You own a building, you can own it until it falls over, basically. And we love recurring revenue here at Tecum. We love businesses that have recurring revenue. So how does that concept play into that valuation number? And is it as good for you guys as it is for us?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is. And I think what you quickly will realize as you get deeper into, real estate transactions is that the end goal for the owner of that real estate is to figure out a way how they can create the longest period of time, usually in lease term, by which they can create a stabilized reoccurring revenue stream. And not only reoccurring in the sense of the dollar that they were anticipating next year, but how do they create a reoccurring revenue stream that's that dollar plus interest or inflationary opportunities, so that dollar turns into $1.10, $1.20, $1.30 in years 2, 3, 4, by way of example. So that not only are they creating a revenue stream that is valued today, but it's growing as time continues, and therefore the value of the asset is appreciating as they create the longest possible amount of time where they can see that reoccurring revenue and have the most escalations of that reoccurring revenue happening kind of in the background, which is typically things that the occupier of the real estate doesn't understand or think too much about. They think about next year's rent, and they don't really think about what that commitment means 2 years, 3 years, 5, 7 years out in the future.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, from Tecum's perspective, I mean, recurring revenue is great, but how do you lock it up? So do you have contracts? How long is that guaranteed? And how do you get more of it? So what are those things that a landlord does to increase their long-term value via that recurring revenue?
Yeah, so in a perfect world, landlords love great credit tenants. I mean, I think if they could have all Fortune 100 tenants, they would love it, because then they could predict the reliability of that reoccurring revenue. But clearly not everybody is a Fortune 100 or Fortune 1000 type credit. So there's lots of tools that they can use to assure that revenue stream continues. Personal guarantees are one way. Obviously, the corporate guarantee of the entity signing it is the most basic of ways. Letters of credit. So sometimes there'll be letters of credit associated with the lease, large security deposits, prepaid rent, anything they can do. In our world, we call it securitizing. Anything they can do to securitize that revenue stream so that both they, and in almost all cases, their lender, feel very comfortable that that revenue stream is as guaranteed as it possibly can be moving into the future. And I think, I mentioned lenders. I think one thing that gets underestimated is that landlords are just, or I should say, that gets assumed that landlords are just really wealthy people and that they don't have any consequences to people not paying rent. But almost all real estate has debt on it, and that debt is serviced by banks, and banks have a tendency to have influence and opinions about things. So you have to not only understand the motivations of the owner of the real estate, but the underlying motivations of the person who's providing the debt on that real estate.
So all that being said, and obviously landlords want to stuff their own wallet as much as the next guy or gal. Why do they then turn around and to companies that we've invested in and every other person that's gone and tried to sign a lease offer tenant incentives and all the other kind of fluff up front? I mean, what part does that play?
Yeah, so the investment up front, or that capital expenditure that happens at the beginning of the lease in the form of tenant improvement dollars or free rent or cash in some cases, is really an incentive, an incentive to get the tenant into a lease that then creates long-term reoccurring revenue and therefore increases the value of the building. And an example would be a situation we worked on just outside of Philadelphia. A client of ours was in a position where they were growing rapidly, but at the same time, the building that they were occupying was up for sale. And the building was about 86% leased at the time that they were experiencing this growth, and the building was for sale. And the building was for sale at a 7% cap rate. So every dollar of reoccurring revenue that was created, like I said, you divide by that 7% and you saw the value of the asset. They needed additional space, but they didn't need it today. And we saw this as an opportunity for them to win and for the landlord to win. There was 25,000 square feet available. And we said to the landlord, how about you sign a lease with us today for that 25,000 square feet? We'll occupy it 12 months from now because we don't need it today. You're going to give us the exact same terms that you would give to any other tenant moving into the building. So the same $50 a square foot TI package, this 12 months of free rent, and we'll sign a 10-year commitment, which really was an 11-year commitment. So 12 months of free rent and then 10 years of reoccurring revenue. And in return for that, Mr. Landlord, your building is going to increase in value the second we sign that piece of paper by $10 million because of the amount of free cash flow that we're going to create for you in years 2 through 11. And of that $10 million, we'd like you to write us a check for $5 million in addition to those things that you would have already offered to somebody else. And you can imagine, as many people who've heard this story, the landlord fell back in their seat and were quite surprised by the question. But after a day of digesting, they realized it's a great question and one more tenants should be asking because we're the ones creating the value in the building, right? So long story short, the tenant was able to get $2 million in cash in addition to those other incentives that would be offered. And it really is as simple as the value of the building went up by 10. So 2 million was, if anything, a discount for what they probably could have demanded. And the reason that they do it, to your question, is because they know that the creation of that rent stream for those 10 years directly impacts their ability not only to create value, but to sell that building. I think the building was under contract to sell within about a week of that lease getting signed. And suffice to say, it probably would not have been under contract to sell without that lease.
Wow. Well, I think Kelly was coughing to remind me I forgot to ask people to ask questions. So if anybody out there has questions, please feel free. Go ahead and submit. We'll get to whichever ones we can as we kind of continue chatting here. So Kevin, talked a little bit now about, landlords, but I don't think we have any real landlords on the call here. So in terms of business owners or people that are going to be, looking for value in their real estate, how does the real estate exposure as a whole affect us? What's the total cost of occupancy, maybe costs that we don't usually think about? How should we think about that total cost picture?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It really is. What is the total cost of occupancy? Too often people talk about the cost of real estate as what their rental rate is, but there's typically substantially more things that come into play. And it's probably a good place to talk about the 3 different types of leases. And there's probably hundreds of types, but they kind of fall into 3 buckets. One bucket is a gross lease, which is legitimately, I pay X dollars per month and absolutely everything is included. And I would tell you that that is the rarest form of leases. It typically is in small size increments. So somebody might be renting an office from Tecum at your headquarters, and you might give them a gross lease where you say, pay us $1,000 a month and there's no other expenses. But by and large, it's the least common because it absolutely puts all of the risk of ownership on the landlord and reduces their ability to create that growing revenue stream, because that, as expenses rise, they have no protection because they're getting a fixed gross rent from the tenant. The most common in the office world, specifically in Western Pennsylvania, is a full service lease. And that typically is, you have a base rent, but in addition to that base rent, you pay for 1 or 2 utilities, so maybe gas or maybe electric or both, plus increases over the base year, which means that if the landlord's expenses to run the building are $10 in 2020, and in 2021 they are now $11, the landlord passes that $1 of cost increase on to the tenant. So tenant has now absorbed some risk, right? Because they have a fixed rate for their base rent, but then they're exposed to some increases over a period of time. And then the least risky for the landlord, most risky for the tenant, but also the most common in the industrial and retail segments of the world is what's called a triple net lease, whereby there's a fixed base rent, often increases over time, but it's a fixed increase or a percentage increase. And the tenant absorbs all additional expenses for maintenance, snow plowing, landscaping, utilities, janitorial, all of those others that are the total cost of occupancy. And I think to your question, a lot of people focus solely on that rent number and neglect to think about what that total cost is, because it is base rent, it is cleaning and janitorial, it is lights, electricity, gas, sewage, water, the maintenance guy, HVAC, roofs, structures, all of those things. Somebody's paying for it. And the question is who, and how do you make sure that you limit your exposure to it?
So how do we, is that a discussion that is kind of upfront pre-signing on the dotted line for a lease? You better be smart on that topic, or is there a way to sort of pass through expenses after the fact? How does a tenant do the best job of avoiding the most cost?
First and foremost, read the whole lease. And I know that sounds ridiculously obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people read the 4 or 5 sections that are jump off the page. Rent, term, guarantee are kind of the ones that get the most attention. But there's usually another 30 or 40 sections of the lease, and all of them are ways in which the landlord can take advantage of. And I'm not saying that all landlords are in the business of taking advantage of people, but it's ways that they can extract more dollars as the lease carries on. And I had mentioned increases over a base year. So in the example that I used, 2020, it cost $10 a square foot to operate the building. And in 2021, it costs $21 a square foot, or I'm sorry, $11 a square foot. The real world example that we're living right now is with COVID. There is no doubt that the cost to operate a office building in the current environment is going to increase exponentially compared to a normal 1 or 2 or 3% inflationary increase. And if your lease does not protect you from those increases, smart tenants have a tendency to put caps on those increases so they know their worst case scenario. But if there is no cap, then that whole dollar, or in my opinion, in this example, I think it's going to be closer to a 20% increase in cleaning expenses, is immediately going to get passed through the tenant, and the tenant won't have much to say about it, unfortunately. And therefore, when you strip it back to the value of that business, you've now lost revenue because you're increasing expenses, and expenses that you could have controlled had you paid attention to that section of the document. And on the flip side, the landlord has protected the value in its asset, because while his expenses increased, his reoccurring net income has not been affected because he's passing that exposure right on to the tenant, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you're spot on. I mean, I when I open up a lease during diligence, it's usually to check the sections where there's numbers actually in there. But I mean, if you're trying to educate folks, what are those 2 or 3 maybe gotcha sections that landlords try to sneak stuff in that maybe the layman wouldn't find on their first pass through a lease?
So I'll start with one that's probably the one that got you the least, but it can be dramatic, and you've experienced it. This is one that you and I worked on, and it's the assignment provision in the lease. So especially in the private equity and venture capital worlds, there's a lot of buying and selling of companies, right? So the assumption is, well, I'm buying this company so I can just take on this lease obligation and the landlord has nothing to say about it. Well, sometimes the landlord does have something to say about it. And in an example that we were looking at for you guys, if you remember, the assignment provision needed landlord's consent, and the market that the building was sitting in had substantially increased in rental rates from the time that tenant signed that lease versus the time they were going to exercise this purchase of this business. And the landlord wanted to extract his pound of flesh during that assignment provision, and said, for all intents and purposes, for me to say yes, I'm going to increase the expense to the tenant. And without getting into all the details, because I don't think it's important, it's just an area where you'd think, well, what does the assignment provision have anything to do with the value of this lease or the expense exposure? And rest assured, if there's a way, the landlord will figure out a way to extract more capital. So that's one. I talked about increases in operating expenses. That's the number one place where landlords are very creative about how they extract more revenue from the tenant, not just in the way they're allowed to pass through increases, but what's included in operating expenses. Operating expenses to me mean the things that are necessary in order for the building to operate on a day-to-day basis. Landlords have a tendency to take a very loose view of what an operating expense is, and they'll add in, by way of an example, something like they're going to add a gym or a conference center to the building. Well, most of them will charge the gym and the conference center rent, because that's space in the building that they otherwise could have rented to another tenant. And that rent gets passed through as an operating expense to the building. So the landlord says to the tenant, hey, this is a great building. We've got this free fitness and this free conferencing center. But the reality is they're probably charging for it in operating expenses and then passing that expense on to the tenants. And then the next layer of that is a lot of office leases, specifically in the full service world, will say something to the effect of, you, the tenant, are going to be obligated to pay your share of the operating expenses, and we're going to gross those up so that the building is 95% or 100% occupied. And in the event that we're not 95 or 100% occupied, you, tenant XYZ, are going to share in the expenses that we have to pay, even if the building's only 50% occupied. So you can see some pretty substantial swings as a tenant. And we are working on one right now where they got hit with an increase in their operating expenses year over year that was the equivalent of 2 months of base rent. And it was directly tied to the landlord losing tenants and therefore passing said operating expenses through to a smaller pool of people. And therefore those people took a big hit to what their rent expense was on a monthly basis.
So is there, I mean, in that scenario, Kevin, I mean, it sounds like they're kind of SOL. Is there anything they can do there, or are they just find a new attorney to review the lease next time? I mean, or is that just market standard?
I think I'll kind of go in reverse. I don't think it's a new attorney. I think it's in having business advisory on the terms that are in the market and what the tenant can command. I think the attorneys read that part of the lease. And from a legal perspective, in legalese, it makes sense and it's fair and there's nothing inappropriate about it. But is it fair in business? And I think that's where sometimes, especially in the private equity space, as you mentioned, you look at lots of deals, you'll read the lease, but you read it in such a passing way that you don't pay attention to those kind of little nuances. But when you get hit with that, what can you do? I mean, it depends what's going on in the market. In today's market, you know, the fact, assuming you're paying rent, the fact you're a rent paying tenant is a really strong leverage position. So I think you can go to the landlord and say, listen, we're a really good tenant. We've continued to be a good paying tenant. We're going to continue to be a good paying tenant. And we realized 4 or 5 years ago, we missed this. This was a mistake. We should not have agreed to this. So what can we do to make it a win-win? And instead of having a 2 month of a rent increase, maybe it's a month, or, you know, the knowledge of what is right and fair, I guess, is a simple way of creating leverage that you can go to them and say, listen, we're in it for the long haul, but we want to be good partners here. I mean, to the extreme, if you only have a couple years or a year left on your lease, you can always extend your lease and say, you know, our lease is up in 23 months and this is an issue for us. We need to reduce this near-term expense, but we're willing to give you additional years of consideration, therefore increasing the value of your building, but we need some assistance on this immediate near-term expense issue.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't envy those guys. I want to go back to your assignment point in terms of reviewing the lease, because I don't know if you remember, we were looking at a deal together in February or March, I think, of this year. And that deal would have closed, but for the landlord kind of withholding the assignment because we didn't want to give better terms. And I wasn't too unhappy about it because we found out the business got destroyed by COVID. So that's another thank you, Kevin, for that one, helping us navigate. But it didn't register until just now that I had a halfway decent story to tell. So
we've been working on one right now, and the landlord is adamant about unequivocal one-way rights on assignment. And it's, as a business owner, how can you sign them? I mean, this business is not owned by private equity, but it's a business who is privately held. And at some point they're going to have an exit. And, you know, their predisposition was, that's not a big deal. And I was like, listen, I don't want you to not move into the space. I mean, it's the space you want and it's a great building, but at the end of the day, if the landlord of the building controls your ability to sell your company, that is not a good thing. Like, you'd be better off paying X more in rent elsewhere than giving up the control of that exit to somebody who has nothing to do with your business. So,
Yep. So one other thing I think a lot of people would be interested in hearing about is sort of the market term on escalations and how much to expect to pay. Is it pegged to inflation? Is it a different kind of market number? How do you look at that number when it jumps off the page and say that's fair or too much, or wow, I'm getting a really good deal in the out years?
I mean, the really good deal is the tenant. I'm looking at most of this conversation in the lens of the occupier of the space, right? Is to have no exposure. So to negotiate a situation whereby you don't have any risk of increases. I'm not a fan of tying it to an index like a, CPI or something like that. It seems very arbitrary. I mean, the kind of next best position is a fixed percentage increase where you say, all right, we know our lease is going to increase 2% every single year for the next 5 years. It's predictable. We know what it looks like. And it's not easy to get landlords to agree to that because, again, it cuts into their ability to create value, but it's a good next position. The kind of next rung down in terms of tenant favorable terms would be a cap on those increases. So landlord has to prove that the increases actually happened. But if they happen, they get capped at a percentage, typically year over year. In Western Pennsylvania, a 3 to 5% cap is fair, or kind of a market accepted reasonable standard that it protects you, the tenant, from getting way out of whack with your expenses and does protect the landlord from inflationary pressure. And then obviously the least tenant-friendly scenario is when there is no cap and the landlord's able to pass that through as it happens. So.
Okay. So maybe we don't want to deal with a landlord. We'd rather deal with a bank maybe. And we got some cash on the balance sheet to put down and we want to build our own facility. I mean, does that turn into a completely different ball of wax in terms of searching for land and then selecting a GC and drawings? I mean, what does that look like from your seat in terms of building versus buying or renting?
Well, I think that building versus renting or buying something existing is really the best time to do it, or the time to really consider it, is when you have something going on in your business, either geographically, the real estate that you need doesn't exist, or physical plant. The existing inventory can't allow you to provide the best possible outcome for your business. And therefore, I think it's kind of where the name came from, built to suit, right? So I have decided that the market doesn't allow me to run my business the way that I want to with its existing inventory of real estate. So I'm going to build to suit for myself exactly what I need. And I have determined, and I think this is a little bit to your question, I think there has to be some strategic planning to go into it to say that the cost increase, because typically that's a more expensive proposition, and the brain drain that will take place on my organization to get from today to a finished building is worth it, because the overall business success will increase so dramatically by being in a facility that's custom built for our specific needs or locations. So I'll pause there and say, is that where you were headed with the question, or were you thinking about it from a different perspective?
No, I think that was kind of exactly what I was looking for, I think. So maybe go ahead.
I was just going to say, and one other thing that I think gets lost in translation with a lot of businesses, especially the smaller to mid-sized privately held companies, is that they get the perception, or the market talks about it in such a way where, Well, it's cheaper to own your own building because you don't have any rent. You just have a mortgage payment. And that's not 100% false, but it's a misnomer because most lenders, unless you're buying or paying for this building in cash, which is atypical, most lenders and candidly most savvy business owners are going to set up the situation whereby one entity, which may or may not be the exact same equity stack as the business, owns the real estate, and then the business still is a separate entity. And 99 times out of 100, that entity is still paying the landlord rent. Now, typically, in our experience, either the landlord's taking a discount or the tenant's overpaying to put extra capital in the landlord's pocket. But the misnomer that just because you own your own building means you don't have rent, I think is something that often gets overlooked. And I've said to many clients, when they say they want to own their building, I'm saying, great, now you need to decide, am I going to be representing you from the perspective of the ownership of the building or representing you from the perspective of the ownership of the tenant? Because those two things are at conflict for sure. And it's completely acceptable for them to be at conflict, but you need to walk into that decision understanding which entity you want to have the upper hand in the conversation, even though it might be a conversation between you, Jack, the landlord, and you, Jack, the operating company owner, right?
Yep, and so that's a good segue into maybe a curveball because we didn't talk about this one, but the concept of the sale leaseback, right? So our operating companies are all, it's never Jack the landlord, it's always Jack the operating company because that's who we're going to sell. We're not real estate barons. So how do you think about sale leasebacks, just maybe the concept in general and how that can increase value for the operating company?
I think they're an incredible tool to create liquidity and use capital that would otherwise be more profitable in the business than in the real estate. I mean, a good real estate return in today's environment is somewhere between an 8 to an 11% cash on cash return and maybe a 12 to 18% IRR. Like those are good returns. They're not great. No one's getting rich off of it, but it's a good return in the real estate space. So back to that conflict between landlord and opco, if you strike a deal somewhere in there, it's fair for all parties. But the vast majority of companies that we come across, especially ones that somebody like Tecum would be investing in, are creating returns that are substantially, hopefully better than that. And the question is the right place for our capital to be deployed in the bricks and sticks and the dirt of this business, of this building, or in this operating business? Like if we can extract $1 million of liquidity out of the real estate, how can we put that $1 million to work in the business and get a 20 or 30% return on that capital?
Yep.
And go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in our limited experience with doing sale leasebacks, we usually don't purchase real estate. The decision point is sometimes, well, do you do it in the very beginning of the deal, and then you have kind of a war chest to deploy as growth capital through CapEx or hiring or what have you, or do you save it until later on? So curious if you have thoughts on when to best execute on that.
Sure. It clearly depends on what the exit strategy of the opco is. But one thing to keep in mind, and I'll kind of tackle this two different ways as you're thinking about it. In order for a sale leaseback to work, in order for it to create real liquidity and actual value, or true value to what the real estate, is worth, or in a lot of cases with sale leasebacks, the real estate value is an underlying concern because it's really kind of a coupon created based on the rent that tenant's willing to pay, but it requires term. So, a sale leaseback of less than 7 to 10 years is really not that attractive to the investor community, and they're going to pay a discount for it. versus sale leaseback where the lease is 10 to 15 or even longer. Now all of a sudden that creates a premium. So as an investor in opcos, I think the horizon time by which your investment thesis is certainly impacts, do I do it immediately or do I do it in the future? Because if I do it in the future, I need to recognize that I will be constraining the EBITDA of that business, because before I sell the real estate, I'm going to have to sign that business up for a long-term commitment. And then, another thing to think about, and we've used this strategy for a few of our PE clients, is going into a situation whereby tenant either owns the real estate and or is a tenant in the real estate, and there's a third party owner. We look at what would happen if we were able to buy that real estate or sell that real estate as a sale leaseback kind of at the beginning of the investment strategy. And what would that liquidity do to our ability to offer more than the competitive investor? Because I think you well know, it's very rare that Tecum's looking at a deal where you're the only one looking at it. And if you can look at the real estate as a way to create liquidity and thereby increase your offer, and the XYZ capital companies not paying attention to that lever, it can be a really powerful thing. We worked on one where the private equity company was looking at a business that occupied about 200,000 of the 600,000 square foot campus. Property was owned by a third party. Tenant, the opco that was about to get invested in, was underpaying relative to the market by about $2 a square foot. So we came up with a strategy where we went to the third party landlord and said, we'll buy the 600,000 square feet, knowing that it was kind of at an under market valuation, because his net operating income on 200 of the 600,000 feet was $2 below market. And we're able to secure a price for that asset at that kind of devalued price. Then the opco, as a part of the new investment, was going to increase their annual spend on real estate to get more in line with market. But that spread created about $8 million of kind of liquidity in the deal. So all of a sudden, the investment firm who was looking at the opco had way more chips to play with than they otherwise were going to have to play with. Unfortunately, that one did not end up happening because the investment group decided that that opco was not a good strategic purchase for them. But suffice to say, it was a very compelling way for them to think about it in a way that they never had thought of before. So
yeah, that's an interesting way to sort of differentiate a bid, and kind of goes to another concept I think we should talk about. I mean, you hit on it. Tecum won't pay 8 times EBITDA for a business if we know that there's 10 other comps out there that have traded at 6 times in the last year. Mm-hmm. So how does that market awareness and market comp landscape affect real estate decisions?
Oh, substantially. I mean, it's extremely competitive. The likelihood that there is an off-market transaction of any scale, I mean, I guess we should preface it by saying a small little building in downtown Carnegie or something like that might transfer friend to friend or friend to acquaintance without anybody knowing about it. But anything of any substance in the multiple millions or tens of millions of dollars, there is such a starvation out there for places to put capital, even at an 8% return, that it's an extremely competitive market and multiple investors looking at every transaction. So, maybe not 10 people looking at every deal, but I think if you would talk to the investment sale experts, not just here in Western PA, but across the country, a substantial amount of activity on anything that's got a good return with good credit tenants and a long-term reoccurring revenue base is extremely attractive. There's
So,
way more capital than there are opportunities.
yep, amen to that. So say if today we're at an 8% cap rate, I mean, could that turn to 10% in December, or I guess January now, or does it take a year for that to move? How reactive is the market?
The market is really slow to react. It does not move very quickly. So the cap rate, and I think where the question is kind of leading to is what's happening with values in light of the world that we live in today. Or maybe I'm just interpreting it and taking it that way. And it takes a long time for it to happen because of the nature of the leases that are in place. Obviously, the more high profile the asset, the longer the leases, the more leases that are involved. You look at Steel Tower in downtown, there's not one lease, there's 100 leases. So for those all to kind of work their way through the negotiation stage to then reduce the net operating income of the building, to then reduce the total value, it takes a long time. And you also have the situation that I said previously, where there, even pre March of 2020, there was so much capital chasing real estate that even if half of that capital disappeared, there's still more capital than there are deals. So in certain pockets or in certain, really specific geographic areas, you might see a quick 50 or 100 basis points change in a cap rate. You're not going to see 200-point swings in a real short period of time. Those types of swings take years for that to happen across the general market, clearly.
Okay. So it feels like kind of a natural time to maybe just touch on Pittsburgh specifically. So what are you seeing in and around kind of Metro Pittsburgh that's good, bad, different today versus last year or as a result of COVID?
Well, very personally, I'm sitting downtown Pittsburgh right now, and if I look out the window, there's not a lot of people here. It admittedly it's pretty depressing, candidly, to look at Market Square. I was walking through Market Square yesterday. There were two little girls performing at one of those little booths for the Christmas Santa shop stuff, and there was two people watching them, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is a unique place to be right now. So there is no doubt that what's going on has impacted the real estate space, because somebody told me last week, Steel Tower typically has 8,000 to 9,000 people a day walk through the door. They're at like 800 right now. So if you think about just that one building, how stark and drastic of a change that is, that's an alarming thing. I'm not alarmed for the long term. I think that the office is not dead and people will be back in the city. But there is no doubt that there's been a dramatic change in the way that people are living as it relates to their real estate right now.
So take this opportunity, I think, Kevin, we got one question and I want to make sure we hit, which is regarding the increased demand for warehouse space. So do you think that's kind of a blip on the radar or a longer term trend that's here to stay?
I think it's a longer term trend that's here to stay. I think you're already seeing signs of increased warehouse capacity and needs. We're a consumer based population, not just in the US, but across the globe. People like to buy stuff, and therefore things need to get made and things need to get stored. And I don't think we will ever get to a place where you can go all just in time from production to delivery to someone's house. Like, that's a stretch to believe that will ever happen, even though I know there's companies who are trying to make that reality. So no, I think demand for warehouse space and industrial space will continue to increase. There has been a spike for sure. We just were fortunate enough in October to close on a transaction that part of the facility is used for 3PL, which is basically short-term pallet storage. So your warehouse is full. You don't need a warehouse in perpetuity, but you've got 500, 1,000 pallets that have nowhere to go. And you pay a premium for that space, but you get to do it for a short-term period of time. And in January of 2020, this asset had about 2,000 pallets in it. And as we sit here today, that number is hovering somewhere around 10,000 pallets. And to put that in perspective, that's about a $500,000 a year increase in income for that small piece of that puzzle. So I think that that's just a glaring example of what's going on out there relative to the warehousing needs. And it's really driven by the fact, the three main drivers of those pallets are dry food storage, medical devices, and high-end electronics. So if you're the producer of those things, you've got two choices: figure out a way to store more of it or shut production down. And is shutting production down really the right thing to do? Or do you believe that eventually things will recover? And if you had shut production down, you would have no product and therefore no sales. So, I'm glad I'm not a producer of things right now. I'm glad I'm in the real estate space because I think that's a really complicated decision to be making. There's a company here in Western PA that we know have increased their warehousing by like 100,000 feet. And I said to the chief operating officer, like, what is going on? And he said, literally all of our product comes from China. And if we shut down production, those production channels will forever disappear. So we've got two choices: keep producing, find a place to store it, or potentially lose our ability to produce that product in the future. And those are, again, I'm not an expert on those things, but those are challenges that are real and are affecting people on a day-to-day basis right now. So
yeah, I'd certainly echo that it's probably a longer term trend that we'll see continue. And we don't do a lot of B2C stuff, but we do some freight brokerage and trucking work. Can't hire drivers. Freight rates are just going through the roof. We do some material handling businesses. Those are kind of taking off like rocket ships. So consumer behavior changed as a result of COVID, like it or not. And I think more people are expecting stuff on their doorstep sooner rather than later. So it's probably going to continue. Kind of bringing it back to the decision making for businesses on their individual real estate. When say our lease is up and OpCo is trying to decide what to do, we can renew, we can go find a new place. How do you make sure that when you're doing an evaluation like that, you're really apples to apples versus apples to oranges?
I think the reality is you need to bring somebody in or have somebody on your team, depending on how big the organization is, that truly understands what apples to apples means. Because you kind of took the words out of my mouth. Too often decisions get made based or relative to real estate based on not even apples and oranges, because those are both fruits. A lot of times it's like apples and broccoli. It's like fruits and it's not even in the same food group. And I think that it is incumbent upon an executive team to really understand what apples to apples means, first and foremost, and be willing to go figure it out. This is a story that will never be forgotten by me. This was a few years ago, but it struck quite the chord. We were in an executive's office, and they were thinking about renewing their lease, and they were thinking about renewing it without any representation and or without looking at the market. And, I asked a few questions candidly that I think that's not really the right way to go about things. I think you need to create leverage, and you create leverage by understanding your options. But I asked the question of, you distribute your material across the globe, and you're located in this small little town outside of Akron, Ohio. And Why is that? And he, I'll never forget it. He looked at me like I had four heads. And he's like, what are you asking? I said, why are you located in this tiny little town when you're distributing your product across the globe? Like, I'm not a logistics expert, but something tells me this can't possibly be the most cost efficient place to distribute product across the globe, because you're not even making the product. You're literally just taking it in one door and passing it out the other door. And long story short, that started a analysis whereby they went to figure out, okay, what really is the apples to apples comparison? Is it just how much rent is the building down the street? No, that's not the apples to apples comparison. The apples to apples is how much more revenue would my business make if I was in real estate that made my distribution network substantially more efficient. And that real estate might be double per square foot than my real estate in this tiny little town. But if my overall revenue and therefore profitability increases, the real apples to apples comparison is what real estate is my next best alternative for my business. They ended up staying in that small little town, but at least they knew at the end of the analysis what their opportunity cost was from their next best alternative. And you said, how do you make sure you get to apples to apples? I don't know that you can ever or always be 100% apples to apples, but what you can do is understand to the penny what your next best alternative is. And once you understand that, it really drives your ability to have a leveraged conversation on the location that is your first choice, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, small little town outside of Akron is really saying something, though. So as we get towards the end here, I mean, maybe talk a little bit about timing, Kevin. I mean, we've talked a lot about different decision points, but do you have to, are these things that only get decided once? Can you only decide it in 6 months before your lease is up? How often should you be reviewing these types of things to see how you can create that leverage?
Sure. So I think first, when there is a critical date on the horizon, i.e. a lease expiration, I think you need to be ahead of that by 18 to 24 months. I think if you're 6 months ahead of it, your only leverage is that you can move quickly. And that is real leverage. Don't get me wrong. That sometimes creates really strong economics when you can say, I can move in tomorrow. But as an organization and from a strategic perspective, it takes time in order to really identify your next best alternative. Coupled with, if you're a substantial operation, landlords are pretty savvy in people, and they know that you can't move a factory or a distribution network or even 100 lawyers. Say you're a law firm, you employ 100 people. To move all of that overnight, it just realistically doesn't happen. So the longer or the closer you are to that date, the less real the other people believe you to be. So when you have time on your side, you can actually do the right fact finding and kind of set the table for the negotiation in a way that the other side truly believes you have options. And if they believe you have options, you've created substantial leverage. So that's first and foremost. And then to the second part of your question, how often should you be reviewing this? And is this like just a one and done type of discussion? And the answer is definitely not. Unfortunately, I can count on one hand what percentage of our clients take advantage of this, but it's a yearly thing. I mean, it really should be a reevaluation of the real estate on an annual basis, because even if a critical date isn't happening in the near future, the people get lulled to sleep by, well, I've got 5 years or 7 years left on my lease. But the reality is the market around you is changing in the buildings and in the geography around. And you want to be aware of those changes so that even if nothing's changing within your business, you can take advantage of those changes in the market to make sure you don't get caught in a position where, for example, all the rents around you are going up and you didn't think about it ahead of time. And now your lease is getting to that point where there's not a lot of time left and you've automatically signed up for a major rent increase, or vice versa, rents are going down and you want to take advantage of that. If you look at it on an annual basis, you have an honest conversation with your landlord or your investor who controls your real estate. I think the misconception is that you sign this document and then it gets put on a shelf. I think it's the type of thing that can live and breathe and kind of amend to its situation on an annual basis. But not enough people take advantage of that.
And since so much of that negotiation, I mean, we could only control what's going on our side of the table, right? What's happening in the landlord's world is going to drive the other piece of it. How do you find out? How do you know? I mean, is it, especially take an operating company that's out in California while we're sitting here in Pittsburgh? I mean, how do you get that intelligence to be able to negotiate effectively?
Ask a lot of questions. I think it's no different than understanding segments of your business, right? You need to know kind of what's going on. And I think it's fair to ask the landlord, what's going on in your business? Tell me about your portfolio. And I realize in your case, if you're invested in 10 or 20 different portfolio companies, it's hard to do that at maybe the enterprise level. But at the portfolio level, I think it's realistic to say to that executive team, hey, keep us apprised what's going on with that landlord. Have somebody on the ground who's in the real estate space, find out, what's going on in the world. Because as you pointed out, what's going on in their world could drastically impact your ability to create leverage that's good for you.
So final question for me, and then maybe offer some final thoughts. If you want to be in tune with the real estate market, what are you looking at on a regular basis in terms of kind of publications or news? Is it you're looking at 30-year treasuries for mortgage rates? How do you kind of start your morning looking at what the market's doing?
There's unfortunately too much information out there, so it makes it like weeding through it all. We subscribe to an organization by the name of CoStar, and right, wrong, or indifferent, they've kind of become the monopoly of the real estate data that exists out there, especially data as it relates to occupancy, rental rates, trades, both, what's coming to be sold or what has sold. So fortunately, they also do a pretty good job of giving like a daily recap of what's going on in the world. And that's kind of my wake up every day and see what's happening there. But again, due to the nature of our business, which is driven mostly by kind of strategic thought and advisory services rather than transaction-based services, spend a lot more time paying attention to what's going on with those businesses than what's going on with that slow moving market, because it moves so slow. And I also think that all you can really control is the information you have at the moment that you need to make a decision. So really understanding what's going on in that market, because we represent businesses all over the country, not just in Western PA. And clearly I can't be an expert about every market in that kind of global view, as you were talking about. But at the moment in time where a decision needs to get made, there's a ton of resources. The availability of data is out of control to really know what's going on in that market at that moment in time, because that's all you can really control.
Right. Well, I'll take my second to say a quick thank you to everybody again, and give you the quick plug, Kevin. Anybody out there that's looking for real help on this sort of stuff that can't do it by yourself, I'd highly recommend Kevin. I mean, most responsive person I've probably ever dealt with, and you have a new deal heading your way you don't even know about yet. So stay tuned. But thanks again, and hopefully everybody enjoyed learning a little bit. And Kevin, if you got anything else.
No, just thank you, obviously, to you, Jack, for helping us way better in the world where we can't really interact with a room. It's hard to just sit on a screen and read through a bunch of slides. So it's great to have some interaction, and I really appreciate that. And to Kelly and Ian and Jordan and Kenny and the whole ACG team. Excited not only to participate, but for the organization to, I think maybe for the first time or relatively infrequently, recognize that real estate can be a real mover of the needle, and excited to have been able to share some insight today, and hopefully whoever's out there online picked up a nugget or two that they can use to their benefit moving forward. So thank you so much.
Great. Gentlemen, that was phenomenal. Kevin and Jack, I mean, you got my head spinning like crazy. And I know that, I'm just the MC, but, as a board member, as a business owner, as somebody who works in the M&A industry, as somebody who does a lot of work with large corporations, one of the things that we're taught is you always have to be evaluating enterprise risk management. When you look at real estate in your portfolio, you're looking at it from not only during an acquisition, like in a PE situation where you may have a portfolio of companies and you have to, not only integrate them in, but try to get the best deal possible, but also try to have the cleanest exit possible. So you're trying to look at minimizing or eliminating risk. On large corporations, whether it's environmental risk that you could have associated with a manufacturing practice at a facility that gets negotiated into the real estate value, or you're looking at just overall real estate, you're trying to make the unknown known, or at least known enough that you can quantify the value and see what kind of risk you're going to take. To me, that's critical. And, you say securitizing, and I like that, but as a board member, we use the enterprise risk management. We have to look at risk and try to figure out how to eliminate, reduce, or manage that risk. Somebody like you doing that in these organizations, I could see you doing this in large, Fortune 500 companies, all the way down to small, companies that just have a lease of a building and they need support. So this is such a timely topic in a year of COVID where there's so much uncertainty, and that you should be looking at all of your different risks. Thank you for putting this on. A big thank you from the ACG, just because I think it was a very valuable topic. So I appreciate that. So for everybody else, thank you for attending today. Kelly's going to send out an email survey link to follow up on the program. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. What's really cool is our next event is one of our marquee events. It'll be the Economic Update Panel, and that'll be on January 14th, 2021, and we'll be sending out information on that. Wish everybody a wonderful and safe holiday season, and thanks again, and take care. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you.
Thank you. Take care.